Hi, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I'm excited to be back from vacation and be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is culture. I'm going to be doing a three-part series over the next couple of weeks, talking about how to think about culture, especially if you are driving some kind of transformation or disruption. And who isn't doing that these days? Because there are so many opportunities, so many changes happening in the world that you can't help but look around and say, here are ways that we could be doing things differently if we only had the idea, the strategy, and also the cultural organization to be able to execute on that. So, what I want to talk about today is to talk about culture. And if, as you can, as you're coming into the stream, if you could just share a few words to describe what your culture is like. I'm curious how you would actually describe it. We oftentimes think about our culture as something we like, maybe some elements that we don't like, but how would you actually describe your culture? What are the words that you would use? So think about that. And if you are so moved, share that into the comments because it'll be interesting to hear from each other what you think about culture and how you would describe it. So just want to say hi to a few people, Dunbar, Javed, and Salvador. Great for you to join. Again, if you can, just share a few words about what your culture looks like, because I think it's a great exercise to be able to describe and put into words the things that we experience every day. So what I want to talk about today is this great quote attributed to Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think he would also add that it also eats it for lunch and dinner every single day. And I love this quote because when we are so focused on the strategy of where we want to go, to talk about the disruption we want to create, the transformations that lie ahead of us, we focus on the strategy. Like, where are we today? Where do we want to be in the future? And how are we going to get there? That is what strategy is. What are the things we're going to do to achieve our objective? And oftentimes, culture falls to the wayside. And what I want to talk about today is how to think about that in a different way, because this quote has so much packed into it. So, one of the ways that for us to think about this is really what is culture. So, just want to say hello to a few other people. Joshua, I love this quote. I always thought I didn't have a culture, but you actually do. Culture is again how we describe ourselves. If brand is how our customers describe us, then culture is how we describe ourselves. So we all have cultures. And Jay, thank you so much for joining again. Good to see you too as well. So I love that, Jay, you're sharing here that for you, the culture is challenging the status quo. So I love that way of describing this is how you show up at work every day, and this is how we do our work together. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why culture is often ignored. One of the things that I oftentimes hear from executives is they say, well, culture is not my job. I'm the CEO, I'm the VP of strategy. Culture is the HR thing. We have a culture guru over here, somebody who is in charge of making sure people have a good time, doing the party planning, all the fun things about culture, celebrating our culture. That's what culture is. It's somebody else's job. I think that's a great idea to have those things, but culture is everybody's job, and especially for the leaders of the firm, because it is so strategic. The other thing that often people say is, well, I'll think about it later. A priority right now is to figure out our strategy, to execute on our strategy. But as we'll talk about in a second, one of the ways to execute on that strategy is to have a great culture. And if you don't have a culture that can execute, then your strategy won't go very far or very fast. And then the other thing I oftentimes hear, especially from startups, is, well, I'll just deal with this some other time because my focus right now is on figuring out product market fit. If we don't get that right, then we'll never be able to be in a place, our money's going to run out to be able to figure out culture. Oh, again, I think having a great culture could probably ensure that you do find that great product market fit. So again, there are these synergies that we oftentimes are kind of aware of in the back of our heads, but we don't acknowledge because, well, it's just hard to deal with culture. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So just checking a couple other comments here. Grana Harva, thank you so much for joining. Reinhardt, you have a good question and quote here. Maybe culture is our identity. Absolutely. It's one of those things that the ways that we describe ourselves is what culture is. It's the beliefs that we have, and it shows up and manifests in our behaviors. I believe that if you just break down culture to two fundamental things, it's our beliefs and our behaviors. And sometimes they are what we write down and say what our culture is, but sometimes it's lived very differently. So, really, truly understanding what culture means in your organization is absolutely key. All right. And Jay says here has a great question. Doesn't a successful vision integrate strategy and culture? Jay, as usual, you're ahead of me. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And the disconnects about which comes first. It's kind of like a chicken and egg. Does strategy come first, or does culture come first? So we're going to get to that. Eliu, thank you so much for talking about what culture is to you. Culture is the custom and the costume, manners and mannerisms, the philosophy and ideology of people. Culture is the totality of people's experience, and culture is the way of life of people. So well done, because so well put of you. So thank you for sharing that. We have so many ways of describing culture, which is, again, part of the reasons why it's so hard to put our arms around this and truly make it work for us. Some other quick comments here. Culture is a blend of many ways of thinking. It is also the product of various negotiations that occur consciously or subconsciously. Thank you so much for this, because I do believe culture happens because we intentionally want to have a culture that is created. But we also have cultures that come up from out of some other area, out of left field. And we don't really know how it came and evolved. So this is, again, my reason for saying if culture is important to you, be very intentional about it. Be very aware of when new elements are coming in that could be great additions to your culture, but also things that may be rising up out of various behaviors and beliefs that may not actually serve you. So let's see. And then we also have Professor Garavalia, who says culture is a lifestyle of various people in the world. That's one way to be thinking about it too. So we have cultures of communities and of countries and societies, of even families. So culture, again, is one of those things. And I want to focus today really on the culture of these organizations that we work in and create together to get some kind of work done. All right, so thank you for the comments. Keep them coming. And what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about this chicken and egg, about culture and strategy. And I saw, Jay Bryant, that you said, hey, culture has to come first. And I do believe in that too as well. My gut instinct is to think about culture first. But in preparing for the stream today, one of the things I realized is that strategy and culture live together. And how do we start tearing this apart and putting it together again in a way that makes sense? So let's take one perspective that says strategy leads. Strategy determines your culture. And the thinking behind that is that because this is especially true if you're trying to create a transformation, trying to create a change or a disruption. Because if your strategy is the same as it ever was, then your culture is probably working pretty well with it. But in many cases, strategy is advocating some sort of shift, some sort of change of going from today to tomorrow. So that execution of that plan, if it's done really well, if you execute on the strategy well, then the thinking is, well, the culture would change along with that. The execution incorporates a change in the culture because, well, in order to make this new thing happen, to do things in a different way, to change the behavior, the culture is going to have to change too as well. One example of this is we're going to have to make decisions faster. The marketplace is expecting us to show up with better and new products that meet customer needs on a faster cycle. And so we're going to have to change our culture in the ways that we make decisions, how we come together. We're going to change those things so that they can support the execution of this strategy. Now, that's a great idea because the way we're thinking about culture is that is a side effect. It is the side result of a great strategy execution. So that's one way of thinking about it. Strategy drives culture. The reality is, most strategies aren't executed brilliantly, aren't executed perfectly. So what happens is you're going through and changing your strategy, expecting things to change, and culture is still sitting over here in the old way, not looking at failure in a different way, not moving faster, very comfortable sitting over here and not moving over to the new way of working. So this goes to the other side of culture coming first to support strategy. And the idea is that culture leads and that it needs to support and enable the strategy. And at a minimum, not impede the strategy from happening. And the reality is that oftentimes you're not trying to build a culture, and that's not the end goal. The end goal is to actually execute on some great business strategy. So the two of them absolutely have to live together. So one of the ways to think about this is, how do these two actually work together? And here's the reality. Take a really close look at your strategy and your culture and understand, if you're going to make this change for your strategy, is there anything that's going to support your existing culture? Because this is one way to think about it. If your culture can be fat and happy and successful without having to change in this new environment, it's going to continue to just do exactly what it did before. Unless there are reasons for your culture to change and to move, to acknowledge that this place where we were very comfortable, we're really happy with the culture, unless there is an imperative to change it, to shift, to support the new strategy, it is not going to change. This is the biggest mistake that I see so many organizations doing. They see the strategy has to change, they see the culture has to change, but the culture is allowed to continue the way it is. The incentives, the rewards, the lack of accountability for that change continues and supports and loves the existing status quo of that culture. So it never changes and your strategy becomes stalled. So one of the key issues here is how to think about that strategy change. And Dr. M, thank you so much for asking this question. Should we have a short-term, medium-term, and long-term a strategy for gradual culture change? And yes, 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 absolutely. And it starts, and these are my to-dos, and I'd like to give you some concrete advice, some pragmatic steps that you can take. The most important thing to do is, as you're looking at your strategy, as we're moving into the fall this year, and after a tumultuous 2 years, we're looking at our strategy going forward. As you begin your strategic planning process, ensure and absolutely make a priority that you're looking at your culture at the same time. In the same way that you think about your strategy being short, medium, long term, and the effects that you have to have and the building blocks you have to put in place in the beginning, you need to do the same thing with culture. You need to know what culture elements need to change in order to support the strategy as it goes through these years of journey you have ahead of you. And that begins with the second thing. But most of the idea here is that you need to understand truly your culture. In the same way that you do a lot of assessments to understand where your strategy is, your positioning in the marketplace and the landscape, the competitive threats, you do the same thing for your culture. Understand and really, truly look and understand and see what's really going on with your culture. So that's why at the beginning of the stream, I asked you to describe, how would you describe your culture? Go back and look at those notes that you may have taken or you have shared and say, is that really what our culture looks like? Do people really describe it this way? Are these truly our beliefs? Are these our behaviors? How are we? How are they in line with each other, or are these other things that are coming up that may be in the subconscious that people are saying to themselves? What are the beliefs that are holding you back? What are the beliefs that you have to jettison in order to take on new beliefs that will move you forward? That assessment, I believe, needs to be part of your strategic planning process. It's not HR's job. It's not somebody else's job to think about culture. It is key and absolutely essential to your strategy to also incorporate and understand how culture is going to support it. So the key, I think, here is wanting to look and understand where strategy is. So, yeah, I want to take one other quote here from Jay Johnson. There's a lot of dysfunction, as Jay says, where for strategy and culture and strategy are opposable. For example, I think this is a great one. At Google, they have a culture, this belief of don't be evil, and yet they are monopolizing and controlling markets. If you take a close look at their cultural statements, that statement is no longer there. I don't think that means that they're trying to be evil, but I think they realize that the idea of values and what's important and the culture of what is acceptable or not is something that's held in attention, because that tension says if our strategy is this, there are some auxiliary impacts on that. And that also reflects our culture and our values in the way that we want to approach decisions that are strategic about how we do things. They all are wrapped up into that. And you talk a little bit about Jay, and bring up this whole point about values and culture, and they are very much aligned. Again, the values are these fundamental things that we may describe and morph over time. I worked with one organization where they had this beautiful value of respect. And it was the idea that anybody could speak up, that we wanted to respect each other. Nobody had a monopoly on good ideas. And yet over time, it had evolved to respect being, we don't disagree with each other. The cultural behaviors around that value of respect had morphed into this wacky space where people didn't disagree with each other ever, face to face in the meeting. And instead, they had to go around back doors and talk to each other offline in private to bring up an issue that they are maybe concerned about. And that just slowed everything down. So because they were intent on creating a very big strategic transformation, they realized that they had to fix this cultural dysfunction. So they took a year as part of their effort to go through this transformation to fix that part. They intentionally started holding meetings differently. They, as leaders, got training on how to encourage voices and to have inclusive behaviors in the meetings themselves. And they set the way, they modeled the way of how to do this. And it was intentional because they said, this is a belief, this is a behavior in our culture that we want to change. So they actively, systematically, and intentionally changed that piece of culture that they really wanted to jettison and have a new idea of what respect actually means. So, um, and Eileen, you have a great question here. Simultaneous symbiosis. I think that's a great way to think about this, in that as you were writing the strategy, you're thinking at the same time, what's the culture? And at the same time, as you're developing the culture, you're thinking constantly, how is this going to impact the strategy? So the two absolutely live together. And so this quote from Peter Drucker, again, attributed to him, there's no evidence that he actually ever said it, of culture eating strategy for breakfast. I think it's a great way to be thinking about it. It may not necessarily be true, but I think the emphasis is so strong because we oftentimes forget about culture. We take it for granted because it's just always there. But when you actually have it at the table, it's actually a very different thing. All right, there's a couple last questions here. Jay, you have a couple of questions here. Is culture the written word or what people practice? And then a follow-up, if you eliminate the words, does the culture go away? I do believe that culture is partly written down, but in reality, it's the practice. Because you could have a beautiful culture statement written down over here, but people can easily ignore it. It's the way they show up. It's the way they sit in the meeting and think about things. It is encompassed in the way people collaborate and make decisions. So it's the actual practice, which is how culture is seen. And the beliefs, the words that we use, the words we say to ourselves are the foundational aspects that drive those behaviors. Again, if you want to change your culture, change your beliefs and your behaviors, and other things will follow. And I'll talk next week about some of the ways that you can systematically do these things too, some very hands-on, tangible actions that you can take, these culture levers, as I like to put them, that you can actually have. Dr. M, you also have this great question. Culture is measurable. Enough validated instruments are available, but these dimensions need to be communicated and leadership needs to be taught. And to that point, yes, culture can be measured. We'll talk about it next week and some of the tools that you can bring in. But there are assessments that you can take, the culture index. There are many ways that you can think about culture. But today, I just want to emphasize the number one thing to do is that you have to think about culture. And we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about it, thinking about intentionally what kind of cultures we want to have. So that's what I have today. I encourage you to join me next week. I'm going to be talking about how to change culture. I call it turning the battleship. And I'll share a story of when I was on a aircraft carrier and the lessons that it gave to me about what culture means. But also we'll dive deeper into some great in-depth pragmatic steps about how you can start changing your culture to be the kind of culture that you want. Again, thank you for listening to me. Have a great week, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a great day.